Hey there, welcome to today's episode. It's going to be a live unedited session where we take a look at the RX1200 plugin from a company called Inphonik. Now, full disclosure, I reached out to Inphonik because I'd heard about this plugin. It had really good reviews. I wanted to try it, so I asked them if they'd send me a copy that I could share with you guys, just show you how this thing works, do a little tutorial walkthrough, that's what you want to call it. Kindly, they agreed, so they sent me a copy, but no money has changed hands, and I'm under no obligation to give anything other than an honest review of this particular plugin. But it is a fantastic little plugin. I'm going to say that straight out of the gate. It is an emulator for the classic SP1200 sampler. If you know hip hop and sampling, if you're just looking at the screen, you can tell that already. That's what we've got here. It's a plugin that works with your DAWs. Doesn't matter which one you use. This comes in the usual flavors with VST, AU, AAX, and I think rack extension format as well. So you can open this up inside of any DAW. I'm going to be using Ableton today because that's my DAW of choice, and you can see me just kind of moving this thing around on the screen. It opens up, and of course we're greeted with something that looks like the classic SP1200 sampler. The cool thing about this is that it's going to save you a lot of money, because if you've ever looked at an SP1200, which I have because I would genuinely love to own one, and if I'm ever in a financial position where I can, I would buy one. But the last one I saw in the UK sold for about £3,500. Very, very expensive. This thing is about 25 UK pounds currently to buy as a plugin. So it's a cheap plugin. It's not even one of the more expensive plugins, but the sound of it, I think, is pretty much spot on. If you go to the Inphonik website, which is what I did after someone put me onto this via a Discord, you can check out the little sample audio clip. And what they've done is they've taken a sample and run it through a genuine SP1200 sampler. And then next to that, they are giving you the same sample run through the RX1200 plugin. And I have to say, it's pretty darn close. It sounds really good, which I think is why the reviews have been so good for this little particular plugin. Anyway, here we are, and I want to do a little bit of a walkthrough with you guys for this. We are using OBS. I've got a couple of cameras set up so that I can show you this, and hopefully we'll be able to flick across and see my push at the same time, because I think it's a really fun plugin to mess around with if you want a MIDI map as well, and we'll talk about that later on. This is the user interface that you can see here. We have the plugin. Of course, it looks like the SP1200. We have 8 sample pads across the bottom. And in order to put samples onto those, you just drag them from your Ableton library, or however you've got your file set up in folders with your DAW. You can just drag and drop samples onto the pads. You get 4 banks of 8 samples, so it's not just limited to 8 samples. And you can choose the different banks by either selecting the bank letter here, where you've got A, B, C, and D, or use this little white button to scroll through and choose a different bank. I can then change the velocity response using this button in the right-hand corner. And with it plugged into my push here, so I'm using my MIDI controller, I can see on my first pad, got a little bit of a kick drum set up. And if I want some velocity variation, I change this from 0%, which is fixed, all the way through to something like 100 or anything in between. And then I can get some velocity variation. Get louder and quieter notes. Above, we have our 8 faders, which you would see on the actual real hardware device. And these devices were made famous by people like Large Professor and Pete Rock because of the gritty lo-fi sound that this achieves. And hopefully I can show you how it kind of emulates this and some of the tricks it's got as we go through. But this is what we have. We have our 8 faders. They change parameters depending on what is on the left-hand side, what you've got selected here. And again, you can just click where it says tune, or you can use the button to scroll through the 3 options. We have tuning. Change the fader here is going to tune the sample up and down, which you can do. Any fader that you change, or the parameter even, you can just double click and reset that back to 0. Let's move over. You've got the decay, which for me is like playing around with the sample length. I think really when you look at the hip hop producers and what they were doing with it, that's what they would do. They would take that little bit of a sample and use the decay to change the length to isolate down to like a little kick drum or something. It's pretty handy, something inside of a sample chop. You also have mix, and you'll notice when mix is enabled, we get some panning options across the top, and the faders are now controlling the volume of each sample. So for every sample, of course, it's probably self-explanatory, but just in case you're new to this, for every sample of the 8, we have a separate independent slider, so a separate channel where that audio is going through. You can pan the sample left and right, and again, you can double click to reset it back to 0. Up here, we have an edit button, but I'm going to come back to that because that is for editing the samples. It's quite deep, and we'll go into that a little bit later on. If I have a pad, you'll notice anything with a sample on it, if we go back to our kick drum, it tells us the sample information. So we've got sample A1 because it is in bank A, and it is pad 1, and it gives me the name of the sample that is loaded in there. You'll notice if I press 8 where I have nothing loaded, it tells me it's empty. If you want to go back to an empty state really quickly, you can just select the pad, whichever one you want, and then press clear, and that will just clear everything out for you. We also have the little display, as we've just been talking about. We can see some information. Let's go back to the kick drum. For every sample, we can change the playback in terms of whether we want to hear stereo or mono, or just the left or the right channel, which is really cool. Good if you're sampling from vinyl. Sometimes in old records, some of the instruments would be panned hard to the left or the right, and that's a good way of isolating those out. If we go to our filters, we've got a couple of choices. You've got off, and then you've got low pass 1, low pass 2, and then this dynamic filter. We have speed. Speed is very important on this device because when we're talking about the original old school SP1200, producers like Pete Rock and Large Professor, they were using a certain technique in order to get an even more gritty sound. So this is a 12-bit sampler. It has a sound already, but to get more out of that, I think the way that that was really achieved was to record the samples in at 45 RPM. Now, the reason they did that was because at the time with the original hardware sampler, there was a limitation as to how long you could sample. It was pretty limited. I'm not sure exactly, but I've got a feeling it was maybe like 10 seconds or so. Not very long in terms of sample time. With something like a plugin like this, you can bring long samples in. Anyway, in order to get around that, what they would do was they would record that sample at 45 RPM and then come in and pitch it down to give them more sampling time. Pretty clever when you think about it, really. But what you can do here, you could do the same. I can sample from my turntable. I could do it in 45, bring those samples in and then pitch, but I can actually do it inside of the plugin, which is really cool. If we bring a sample in and we go to speed, I can just set the speed of that sample to play back at 45 RPM instead of 33 RPM. So you can get that grittier sound, because I think when you do it at 45, and you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong here, but I think that's what it sounds like to me. If you set it at 45 RPM and then start pitching down from there, it gives you even more of that kind of lo-fi, raw, gritty kind of sound. Anyway, those are two options. We also have half speed. You've got times 1.5, so speeding up a little bit, times 2, and 78 RPM. So you can experiment and try it and see what different results you get. We've also got fine tuning here, which is useful. Let's say you've got sample chops and you've got a little bass note sample. You're trying to pitch it, but it's just slightly off. You can fine tune to find out what you need. We've got gain. The gain is interesting because it's separate from the main mix controls. So if it was pad 4, for example, and I change the volume of this, you'll notice this display isn't changing. It's not affected by that. Now, of course, I don't have that particular pad highlighted here, but let's do it for pad 1. If we're on pad 1 and I change the volume, you'll notice it's not changing. That is an independent gain control per pad. We also have our outs. Now, these are useful as mute groups, choke groups, whatever you want to call them. So if you set every single pad here to the same output, it acts like a choke group, so you won't be able to play two samples or overlap them at the same time. That's very handy for sample chops. Over on the far right, we have our master mix volume. Self-explanatory, of course. It's your main output volume for the plugin. And then we have this second little display where it says disk here. If I just click on that display, it opens up a menu. But if I press load, it opens up the same menu as well. There's a couple of ways to access it. Let's open load or press load. This brings us to the first kind of behind the scenes menu. I'm going to start at the top on the left hand side with templates collection. You will see you have these default templates, and it's not about what sounds it loads up, but it's about the parameters that have been set inside of the application or the plugin. So you can see what it's going to do. All clear. But the first one, it's going to set all pads to filter, low pass 1, speed times 1.5, tune -7, gain plus 1.5 dB, and a mix of 96%. So it's just a way of doing things quite quickly, so you don't have to change all your parameters to the same value if that's how you want to begin. And you've got plenty of these to choose from. You can experiment. Depends on what your needs are going to be. There's loads of those. Underneath, we have the user collection. It's cool that you get these little old school disc icons as a little nod to the old samplers. I have nothing in here currently because I've only just got this plugin. But if I put a bunch of samples onto my pads throughout my banks, chop them up, I've got this neat little set that I want to come back to time and time again, play around with it. I can save that as a user collection. Underneath, we have the factory collection where they've given you a bunch of built-in content when you download the application or the plugin. It gives you a lot of sounds to play with. You'll notice something like the Alive and Kicking one at the top. It's giving you samples on all banks, on all pads. They're not all like that, but there is loads of this built-in content just to get you started. You can see as I scroll down, there's loads of these kits to just get you up and running. So you don't even need to worry about having too many samples if you're kind of new to this. You don't have many sample packs yet. There's a bunch of gear in here to get you going. If you want to listen to those, you can do it in here just by clicking on the colored pads as well and just take a listen. You can audition some of the samples that way. Underneath, we've got this ambient. This currently is ready to be downloaded. I haven't done it yet. I haven't got that far with it, but you can see what they're doing. They're going to give you some extra content that you can download and store in your collections. So this plugin has moved on from something that I initially thought was just going to be something to give you like a little bit of a lo-fi effect into a bit of a sampler where you can edit things. And it also has some content of its own, which is really cool. Now, I don't know for the future whether they're going to be adding more to this, if it's paid, if it's free, but it is going to flesh out this particular plugin. We can now close this because we don't need anything else from this particular screen. Gives you some information, obviously, about the samples. If you create your own user collection, like we just mentioned, you've got all your samples laid out, a bunch of banks, all pitched and how you want them. You can press save in order to create your own user content. I can give this a title for whatever it is. I can give it an author, and I can also put some comments in if there's anything that I need to know. I can still audition the samples as well right here for anything that I want to put in here and save. The one thing that I don't know, which I'd like to know, and you can let me know in the comments if you already have this plugin, is whether you can share these kind of, these presets. It'd be great if you could make one of these little groups and share it with somebody else who has this plugin. That would be kind of cool, but I don't know if you can. Let's cancel that out. The next menu we want to look at is the settings menu. So we have a cog icon in the top right hand corner. Let's go in here. You can see typical settings menu. Let's start in the top left corner with channel polyphony. So by default, they're kind of set to monophonic. You can see that because it's just one in terms of polyphony across all 8 sample pads. But you can increase that up to 8, which is really good. It gives you the option to then do some layering. It's just going to open up your sound design options. I don't know whether you could actually do that on the original SP1200, but you certainly can in here. With the MIDI keyboard layout, what it's telling you is how it's going to split your banks of samples across a MIDI keyboard. So you've got a plugin, a MIDI controller plugged in even. You can change how that kind of functions, how it's laid out. You've got octave and you've got linear, and you can see the way it kind of groups between, or it leaves like a little bit of a gap. It's up to you depending on what you prefer. It might depend on what MIDI controller you're using. We also have display zoom, very handy because sometimes you've got like a very high resolution, maybe like a big monitor. Sometimes the information can be quite small. So you can either make this smaller or you can make it larger depending on your needs. We're going to stay with 150%. Gives us some basic information. We've got the firmware version 1.10 currently as I'm making this video. So hopefully we'll see some updates as things go through. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with it, but they might add new features, new sounds. We have our plugin format. In this case, I'm using VST. Apple Silicon is the architecture because that's what I'm using. And of course, Mac OS because it's a Mac device. I can open the support page, the online manual, or open the content folder directly from the plugin. That I think is absolutely fantastic, especially the manual, because I hate searching for manuals online. If you've ever gone to, what am I thinking of? Roland's website. If you go to Roland's website, you have to look up the device. Then there'll be a big list. Then you have to choose from those. And then there's something about having to agree to download it. It takes forever just to get the manual. This is right here with one button. You can open it and you can see what you're doing. We've got some options underneath. Enable keyboard shortcuts. So there's some shortcuts. You can see those inside of the manual. And we also have select pad via MIDI when sequencer is stopped. Not overwhelming either. I don't like it when there's too many options inside of like a plugin or like an app. Just gives me a headache. We'll close that out. Finally, we can take a look at the edit menu. I just want to show you again though the kind of drag and dropping because I didn't really show you that at the beginning. I've loaded up a couple of samples to get us started. But let's say I go back to my drums here inside of Ableton. Got another kick drum. Let's say I need another kick drum. I'm just going to put it where I think is an empty pad, this case 7. Let's load that up. That should be now on my pad 7. And I can hear it. Let's enter the edit menu. where you can then see all of your samples and you can do a few more things. This reminds me of the SP404 Mark II editor app. It's kind of the same thing where you can tweak the sample start and end points. There's quite a few things you can do. So let's run you through this, starting with the top left. We've got these 3 tabs, so it's a little home for where samples will be. You can set favorites, so you want to come back to things time and time again. We've got collections, which is all the onboard samples that they're giving you. So again, the content that they're providing when you download this plugin. Starting with like a kicks folder all the way through, there's 11 categories. But you'll notice as I do kicks, opens up on the right-hand side. This is a pretty comprehensive list of kicks. They're not giving you just a small amount of samples to get started. This is a lot of samples. So again, props to doing that because they don't need to give you that much to get started, but they are. Same with the snares, hats, toms, whatever. You've got a whole bunch of stuff in there. When you're selecting things, just like we did before, I can drag and drop from Ableton from my DAW, or I can drag and drop from here. And I can just put this one in. We got this 808 kick. Can click on it to play it. I can play it just, it auditions when you click the sample. When you press play, the top menu there. If you've got autoplay on and you've got your typical like computer keyboard, you can use the arrow keys to scroll through. It's a fast way of being able to scroll through the samples and audition them. And you can change the audition volume there if they're a little bit loud. When you start loading things up as well, you'll notice that we are loading to bank A. So we've got bank A, 1 to 8. Underneath on the bottom left, we have bank B, bank C, and bank D. So you can access all of the banks here and just be dragging and dropping samples in. And you can actually access all of them as well. You can grab all of these samples at the same time and just, start putting things in here. Or all of the banks even is what I'm trying to say. So let's go back to bank A where we got some things. Some other basic functions. If you right click on one of your samples, you get a bunch of different options here. So let's say I want to just duplicate that pad, can send it wherever I want to go, can send it to other banks. You can duplicate pad to all banks, and you can do the same just for the settings for a particular pad. I can send that to other places, other banks, and I can copy the pad settings to all banks. That's if you right click on your pad, so pretty handy stuff. Let's say we want to mess around. What have we got here? This is our first kick drum that we just got loaded up. We have the menu. That's where you can first start changing things. So if we go to the menu, you'll notice I can normalize, I can truncate, I can reverse the playback of the sample, I can revert the sample, which means that if you've made some changes to it and you just want to undo those, you can revert. If you want to clear it from the pad, you can do that. You can just clear a sample right out. And of course, you can apply some color, which is useful when you create your own little user collections. Maybe you want all of your kick drums to be pink, all of your snare drums to be yellow, so on and so forth. You can do that. We can close this menu up. You can see that it gives us a nice high quality little waveform view where we can kind of dive in and change the sample a little bit. Gives us a few options. Tells us some basic information at the top. So sample A1, because it is, in bank A and it is pad 1. Tells us the name of the sample that we're messing with. And then we've got our start and end points on the top row. The start point is adjusted by this bottom left little handle here. There's like a little circle icon where I can move my start point for the sample. There's a little bit of dead space on this sample, so we'll move it along. And if I play around with the endpoint, you will see I can do the same thing there as well. Good way of dialing things in. Underneath, we have fade in and fade out, so kind of like attack and release, if you will. We can do that with the handles on the waveform view, where you can just drag these top handles, so the top left and the top right, where I can put a fade in, and of course I can grab the end, and I can put a fade out as well for the sample. So you can play around. If we wanted to take a look at another sample, let's take a look at this one, and we want to play around with the looping mode, so we can just have it in one-shot mode. I'm going to use my push controller, play this, but if I put it into loop, it's going to do exactly what you expect. It's going to loop that sample. Come back. Then we've got the ping pong loop, which again is quite well known on most samplers. It will bounce the sample back and forth, play it in reverse. Oops, my bad. Pressed the wrong thing there. Let's open up our pad. You get the idea. So we can mess around in that way. Once you've set a looping mode, so away from one shot, you can then set the loop start and the loop endpoint, which is great for just doing sound design, narrowing in on a waveform, maybe just cropping out a small piece of that sample. You can do a lot with it. So that's the basic main functions in terms of this particular screen. shows you where you can find your samples, how you can just drag and drop them in, you can organize them, move them around, and play around with some basic editing of those. What I want to do next is I want to take a look at the sort of basic features and functions from the main screen. So let's use the tool here. I want to clear this pad. I'm going to clear this pad, and I'm going to clear this one as well. Don't forget, you can do that from the main screen. But I want to do it here because I just want to use a couple of built-in samples to do something. So I'm going to load in this kick drum. We'll load in, I don't know, hi-hat of some kind. Nice and simple. And then let's take a snare drum. That one sounds kind of cool. So we've loaded those three up. I can play them on the controller. Get something happening. You'll notice that it maintains some of the presets that we had before, even if you've swapped the sample out. The same with the color. It hasn't changed the color. Even though we deleted that particular sample pad, it's kept the color there for us, which can either be handy or it might be something that you need to change. So we've got a couple of samples there. We're going to go back to our main page, and I'm just going to choose a long melodic sample because I don't know if I've got one loaded up. I don't think we have now. Let's go into my folder for Ableton. I'm going to go to sample packs. And I'm just going to drag in any one of my own loops. I don't want to get in trouble for copyright. So I created this loop as like a fake vinyl sample, if you will. If we quickly go back into edit, actually, you'll be able to take a listen to this. It's on pad 4. And what I want to do is I just want to shorten the sample a little bit. Can see as we've made that edit, we can just make it a little bit shorter, only for demonstration purposes. Close this back out. That way we can test some of the other basic functions. So when we're inside of our mixer view like this, and we have our faders, if we have something like our kick drum, which I can access here, the volume fader is going to do exactly what you expect. It's going to change the volume for that particular sample. I can then pan that as well. And if you were listening in headphones, then you'll hear the difference there. Then we get onto things like the tuning and the decay. Now you can do that for, of course, you know, a kick drum, a snare drum, whatever you want, but it's kind of cool when you do it with melodic samples. So I want to show you some of the differences. Let's start with tuning. And I want to start with 33 RPM. So we're going to bring this fader all the way to the top. And I'm going to play this melodic sample, just kind of play it over a little bit as we pitch the thing down. But this is what it sounds like when you start pitching at 33. Get the idea? And I do think it changes. I think as you go into 45 RPM mode, I think you get more of that kind of grittier kind of feel. To my ear anyway. Let me know if you disagree with that in the comments, but that's what I think is happening here as we increase this and we bring it in like the sample was at 45. It feels like it's just not very extreme, but it's a slightly different feel to the way this is when you start applying that kind of effect. So we'll do the same, but this time at 45 RPM. Definitely feels like that to me. It's more lo-fi, more gritty, really giving you that SP1200 sound. Again, we can double click to just reset any parameters that we want. Finally, just for the basic functions, let's move over into decay where we can take a look. And again, this just refers to the sample playback length. That's how I look at it. You want to just isolate, you've got a few sample chops or there's something, you've got like a kick drum. You don't want it to play the whole sample, just a kick. You can use decay to kind of narrow that down. If we have a low value, the shorter and the lower the value, the shorter the sample is. The playback. You can hear that. Of course, it's decay, so it's applying like a little bit of a fade out to the end, but that's what it was like on the original sampler. So that's all of the basic functions. We've had a look at the user interface. The final thing is just a little chat about MIDI mapping, how you can kind of set that thing up. Most of it seems to be MIDI mappable. Certainly all of our faders here are, and you can map those for the different parameters. So you can have it set so that it's going to map for your mix and for your tune, for your decay. You can set your panning as well. Master volume, you can map velocity response, and of course all of the pads, they're already mapped. Just want to show you a couple of things though, the way that I've got this thing mapped up, and I've been using, hopefully we can switch views via OBS over to my push view. The thing that I like about this is that it's 8 pads wide. So it works really well with this particular plugin because yeah, we've got our 8 samples across here. So this would represent bank A. And if I use my octaves, I can switch between the other banks as well. So I can access my samples here, as you just seen. Hopefully it's clear enough on the screen, but I came in and did a little bit of configuring inside of Ableton. I haven't finished with it yet. I just did a basic thing so that I could see what I could map. And if you take a look on bank 1, I've mapped all of the pitches. So with our sample, our melodic sample, I can pitch this up and down a little bit here. Which is really cool. If I move over a bank, I set it up so that it would then be playing with the decay. And then on another bank, I've got the level, so on and so forth, because you can create multiple banks of these that you can set up. Again, with the push controller, it works very well because we have 8 encoders for dialing things in. So using the faders and all that kind of stuff. One thing that I haven't discovered how to do just yet, and it could be user error, is to map out the button. So if I just switch back over to our view, these little white buttons where you can select the different options, a couple of things like that, I haven't worked out quite how to MIDI map that yet. I'm hoping that's available because, like I said, I want this to act as much like a piece of hardware as possible. And for me, that just gives me a much better experience of kind of just manipulating things, because I can load this up directly from Ableton. Perhaps with other MIDI controllers, other, DAWs, you could do the same thing. But it's really fun to MIDI map it out, especially when it comes to like finger drumming and playing on the pads. The other thing I want to show you just quickly before I sign off is that it is MIDI information. So if we just move this, we could close this down, but I'm just going to leave it up at the top for a second so that you can see it. It still works with things like MIDI capture, particularly inside of Ableton. So if I do this, give myself 2 bars, I can use my MIDI capture button. And you can see all of those samples that we've played in are here. We've got all the MIDI information even available to us so that we can change our velocity. We could move things around, shift things off the grid. And it's very easy to do some resampling as well. So if you want to work in a slightly different way, I could set up a drum loop very similar to this, maybe just gritty these up, get them as kind of lo-fi feeling as possible for my drum sounds. And then I could resample this drum loop, put that into a simpler, and then I can chop it further from there using like my push 3 and go from there. Anyway, I think I've said enough about this particular plugin. I think it's really good. I think what they've done with the sound is probably about as close to an SP12 as you're going to get without actually buying one, which of course is a very expensive experience. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. Let me know if you've got any questions in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.